You can't see me, but I'm wearing an awesome Single Tracks hat right now. It's actually the reason my voice sounds so amazing. Okay, so maybe not, but you never know until you get a hat for yourself. Go to shop.singletracks.com to find Single Tracks hats, t-shirts, stickers, tubular headwear, and can coolers. Shipping is free within the USA, and your purchase helps support the Single Tracks podcast. That's shop.singletracks.com, and thank you for your support. Hey everybody, welcome to the Single Tracks podcast. My name is Jeff, and today my guest is Doug Blease. Doug is a mountain biker and environmental researcher based in Scotland. He's a member of IMBA-EU and has served in active trail planning roles with the Aberdeen Trail Association. Thanks for joining us, Doug.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your academic and professional background.
Oh, well, my background really is one of primarily playing outside. I think that's how I describe it to most people when they ask.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. I kind of like to think that I'm a professional at playing outside, and I'm lucky enough now to kind of get paid to at least play outside for 50% of my time. But yeah, playing outside when I was young was followed by a period of time working in the forestry sector, and then subsequently studying for a degree in countryside management and environmental management. And then since that time, I've worked as an environmental consultant with one of Scotland's best team of ecologists, a company called EnviroCentre. So that's since about 2009.
Okay.
And of course, I still like playing outside. So there's a theme here, really.
Yeah. Well, what kind of projects do you work on professionally? Like, are we talking like buildings or things that are being cited for particular environments?
Yeah, I suppose. Well, actually, the market's changed even since 2009. So when I first started professionally playing outside, it was all renewable energy projects and onshore wind farms and hydroelectric schemes. And then just political shifts in the UK removed a lot of the incentives for those schemes. So our markets really changed really strongly towards housing developments.
Okay.
Been a big shortage in housing developments for a number of years. And so there was a bit of a catch-up game in the UK economy. So we started to become approached by housing developers, and for the last maybe 7 or 8 years, that's been a strong focus. And nowadays, it's moving again towards energy infrastructure and cable connection routes and road infrastructure. Seem to be big players in what we do. And then just increasing now is really focused once again on non-development related projects, more around recreation, countryside recreation, countryside access, habitat creation and habitat management is coming back towards us as professional ecologists again. So times are shifting.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I don't know that everybody realizes, that basically when any project is done, there is this sort of environmental assessment that's done. And, whether that's a wind farm or a housing development or what we're going to be talking about, trails. So how have you been involved in mountain bike trail planning and development over the years?
Well, again, bringing you back to playing outside, I'm sort of not ashamed to admit that living in an area where there's very little invested in formal trail infrastructure, I've spent my own time in the forest with the tools, with or without permission, looking after the wild trail network. So that's really how I got interested in, as a mountain biker, interested in countryside management and access, and also the creative element of building and maintaining trails, and that kind of I suppose sense of altruism that you get from doing something like that. That's how it first began. And then a couple of years ago, I was approached by now a good friend Will Clark at Developing Mountain Biking in Scotland, which is our industry body, with the idea of forming a committee he just sort of handpicked some like-minded individuals and brought them together we all wanted to do something better for our region and be less disparate and underground and more open and inclusive, and trying to progress some stuff in the bike scene that was really ramping up. So, our nearest formal trail infrastructure is many hours drive away, really. We have a small element here, but nothing significant. So that kind of gap really sparked my interest in trail networks. And really that's how planning and development of mountain bike trail infrastructure began. It was completely voluntary and not really linked to my professional career. Maybe really in a really cunning way, Will identified that what I do for a living kind of has a crossover, and I have a professional network in as much as I know a lot of the landowners and I know a lot of the land constraints regarding trail networks. So things began to kind of escalate quite quickly, and us as a group, a volunteer group, found ourselves, I would like to say, at the forefront of the kind of UK Trail Association movement.
Yeah.
And more I started to use my academic background and my current professional career to sort of complement that. In the local land management circles, I was able to speak about conflicts from a non-mountain biker's perspective, and kind of hold that middle ground quite strongly. Moving on from that, it's actually developed into the team that I work with at EnviroCentre really being approached by community groups and landowners about the possible environmental impacts of future trail projects. So it actually, it was born out of what I do for a living and my playing outside, and then it's now returned to becoming something that we actually deliver as a team on a commercial status, but obviously in support of what we believe to be projects with good environmental performance at heart.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting that you started out building trails, let's say unofficially, because, a lot of times there's the impression that unofficial trail builders are not necessarily thinking of the environment when they're doing what they're doing. I mean, has that always been something you've considered? Like, whether you're building an official trail or not, sort of thinking about how is this going to impact the place where I'm building the trail?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But for me, it would probably it's second nature. It's not something that I necessarily have to plan. So if I was working on a trail independently, it's something that's been in me my whole life, really. So actually having the chance with the Trail Association to speak about these subjects with other people that have to actually consciously think about those elements before they even pick up the tool has been a real eye-opener, and it's been a real pleasure to share knowledge and then in return gain knowledge, because I'm not the world's best trail builder and certainly not the region's best trail builder, and I learned heaps and heaps out of people that can build really good trails, and I've been able to tell them about the habitats that they're working in and what we ought to be thinking about, and it's been completely productive. It's not a constraining issue. It can be like anything, right trail in the right place, built in the right way, is of minimal impact, really, and it's of a social good. So it's a really good mix of that social, environmental, and local economic mix. If you get it right, bang in the middle of that mix, then everyone's happy.
Yeah. In the United States, and I imagine other parts of the world as well, trail planning and approvals can take years. And a lot of times environmental impact considerations are required, and some of those can be pretty time consuming themselves. So are these studies generally pretty standardized, or do they have to be customized for every trail project that you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. And I would concur, like the projects here seem to take a very, very long time to come to fruition. The trick, obviously, when you're standing on the sidelines is kind of hoping that the people involved in the center of the project kind of maintain their motivation. But it seems to be mainly due to issues around in Scotland in relation to land ownership and community transfer of assets. So it's a famous statistic put out there that there's only about 480 people own the majority of Scotland's land.
Oh, wow.
And that's, you're talking about some of the most affluent people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need a mountain bike trail centre on their land.
Right.
They already have billions in the bank. There's nothing to incentivize them to do that. So community transfer of public owned land seems to be, or charitable trust owned land seems to be the way forward. But that even in itself seems to be a very, very lengthy and difficult process. And that's before you even start raising money to build your trail project. So yeah, I can sympathise with that, and almost it's quite comforting to know that maybe Scotland's not the only country in the world which suffers lengthy projects. But in relation to standardised surveys, yes, in a way, there's a raft of standard survey to be done for a range of different species and habitats, and we have what's called, well, our industry body is the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, and they produce the guidelines, the standards that we're supposed to meet for surveys, so that if anybody wanted to scrutinise the work or the results, they can refer it to that body. So in that sense, yes, people phone us up and say, can I have a habitat survey? And we will design it to meet those standards. In terms of where it's not standardized is just the approach that we take on a site-specific project. So whilst I suppose, after the inquiry, the next thing we do is actually start researching the land and the landscape. And so we have various resources that we can tap into to sort of tell us anything that we might not know about this land and what species or habitats may have been recorded there, or what designations, international designations might apply, or local designations might apply to that land. And that really forms how you approach your project on a site-specific basis. And it in the broadest sense, it'll focus you on what you're going to be looking for, what should be there, what might not be there, and makes your field survey as robust as possible when you turn up. So we call it a desk study, but it's background research really on the exact land we're going to survey.
Okay.
That then forms really, I mean, the modern approach now is called a preliminary ecological appraisal. So in the broader sense of the word, a client might say, hey, we've got this idea for a trail centre or some new trails. We've been asked by our local authority for some ecological input. And so if we roughly know what you want to do on your land, then we can do what's called a preliminary ecological appraisal. And that forms the direction the project will take to minimize negative effects on its ecology.
Well, let's talk about some of the specific potential types of environmental impacts that are associated with trails. And the most obvious one to most mountain bikers is erosion and soil compaction. What are some of the concerns here that are specific to mountain bikes as opposed to other groups like, hikers or equestrians?
Oh, that's really interesting. I've kind of followed the hiker, equestrian, mountain biker comparison, division, argument, debate
Yes.
for quite a while. And I find it, because I have a background in studying countryside management, and a big part of that is access. Mm-hmm. And Scotland's access laws are really open and quite sort of world leading in that respect. Mm-hmm. It's something that, a countryside management geek like me kind of watched from the sidelines with great interest and, try and be impartial. But I suppose in one way, we could look at erosion and soil compaction. I believe that there's enough studies out there now that says that there's no significant difference in erosion between mountain bikers, horse riders, and hikers or trail runners.
Okay.
But when I look at that, I think, has that been looked at on the basis of a constructed, and what we probably don't add in there is then every time we dig a wild trail, essentially that's another form of erosion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not even riding the bike at that time. It's just people on the ground digging.
Yeah.
So we're eroding the land before we even ride it. So that, when we look at those studies, I kind of, like the scientist in me then says, well, what hasn't been accounted for in that study? If it's just tire tread on a trail, then bikes probably don't erode trails more than any other land use. So once you start to scrutinize it, I think it starts to unravel a little bit, and maybe not totally in mountain bikers' favor. A badly dug a natural trail which drains really badly can be really erosive. I mean, essentially, we can see trails now that, like a fall line trail straight down a hill, that you've just dug yourself a stream.
Yeah.
It will just, when it rains, it will run with water, and whether you're riding or not, it's eroding.
Right. And when we look at that too, it's like how much more could, one really strong rainfall erode an area compared to, 100 or 1,000 passes by a biker or a hiker. I mean, what we're really talking about is water and water management and kind of making sure you're accounting for that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I was recently sent, there was an IMBA video on trail construction and the angles of fall dependent on the gradient of the hill, and it just made complete sense. And, you just think, oh wow, if we could only get every trail digger, whether they have permission or not, to sit through the hour and 20 minutes of that video, that would be incredible. But I mean, it's such a nuanced thing, erosion. But anyway, it's such an open-ended discussion that we could go on for hours about that, I suppose. But for us, I mean, we are essentially professional ecologists, and so I listed a few potential impacts here that of a project that, when we talk about potential impacts, we talk about those impacts that, like you said at the beginning, if you don't think about them, this might happen.
Mm-hmm.
So we would call them like unmitigated, or they could be avoided, knew about them up front.
Mm-hmm.
So a typical formal bike park construction might have the potential for tree or woodland removal or other habitat removal. So most of our trail centres in the UK maybe are linked around public forests. So first off, you'll probably have to fell some trees or fell some woodland. If it's not a tree or woodland removal, you might be thinking about, and if those international viewers can imagine, like the upper section of the Fort William Downhill World Cup course, there's no trees there, but you might have an effect on that's what we call peatland, mm-hmm. or grasslands and wetlands. So your trail route might have an impact on those habitats. So you might essentially lose those habitats to your trail, or you might, in the very least, split them in half because you're cutting a trail through them. Then you might think about, well, okay, where's the material going to come from for your trail? So you're going to have a quarry on site, and for your aggregate, and this country we call them borrow pits is another way of describing them. You're sort of borrowing the material and using it elsewhere.
Right.
Well, that's going to, so we count that as habitat removal as well. So we actually map all these things and measure them in our GIS packages, and we can quantify the square meterage of habitat that you're going to remove as part of your project.
Does that just refer to like the trail corridor itself, or are you, by adding a trail, are you like cutting off or sort of isolating these ecosystems? Like, for example, if you cut through something, like, are animals or plants no longer able to like travel in the way that they were able to do previously?
Yeah, indeed. So we call that fragmentation. So you're fragmenting the habitat, and some habitats may be more sensitive to that than others. So it's not necessarily, it may not be a significant impact. But if your project goes through to full environmental impact assessment, then yes, you'll be asked to consider the movement and the maybe even the population dynamics of that species on site, and whether that will have an impact or not. But in terms of material, again, if you're not quarrying the material on site and you have to import it from another source, you may be raising or lowering the pH of the surrounding soils. So that might affect which plants grow at the edge of your trail. It could be a positive. You might end up with a more diverse range of plants, or you might lose diversity. So there's lots of different things to think about there.
Yeah.
One of the things we think about a lot with trails, like you said before, was the movement of water. And I actually think that more thought about not necessarily, we tend to think just about surface water when we think about trails. Like, oh, is that corner going to drain well? But sometimes what we don't investigate early enough, I think, as an industry, is the movement of groundwater. So sideways movement of water through the soils. And as soon as you put an excavator bucket into that soil, you'll realize where the water's coming from.
Right.
And it could be the driest day of the whole year, and then you dig down and you realize that there's water actually coming up from the ground.
Yeah.
So groundwater is an interesting subject for us, and the plants which rely on groundwater, we would call them groundwater dependent ecosystems, and those can be very, very susceptible to severance by trails or even just the foundations of a building, for example. Then this is going to sound like a real list of terrible things. But I'm trying to come at it as from an environmental point of view, not from a mountain biker's point of view. But like I said, these are the things that if you don't think about them, they will happen. And the next kind of one on my list is pollution. And we think about pollution in terms of like oil spills or chemical pollution of our seas or something like that.
Yeah.
But actually, just sediment into a local stream can have polluting effects on a river, because you can be introducing a higher level of nutrients to the river, or you could be smothering the spawning beds of fish. We have a really interesting species in our region called freshwater pearl mussel, and it's incredibly rare, but it's incredibly sensitive to having sediment introduced into its ecosystem. So when we drain a hillside to create a trail, we're actually trying to get water off our trail all the time. So we are in fact increasing water and sedimentation into the nearest stream, which flows into the nearest tributary, which flows into the nearest river. And whilst we might not, as mountain bikers and trail builders, we might not cause a mass extinction of a particular species, we're still maybe contributing to the sedimentation of rivers, which in general isn't a great thing to have.
Yeah, I know there was a case like this in Colorado, one of the trails in the Colorado Springs area that was popular. It was identified that there was a certain species of fish in a stream, a small stream in the mountains, and a trail happened to run beside it. And there was the same kind of study and an argument that maybe the trail needs to be rerouted because bikers and hikers too are introducing sediment into the stream, which is not good for the fish.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Perfect example. And frankly, it probably happens more than we realize. If nobody was looking at that particular fish species for any particular research reason, then we would never have realized.
Yeah.
And it would have just carried on for years and years. And then really to build on your example, the general potential that the works involved in building a trail center. So when I think about that, I'm not thinking about a couple of guys quietly digging in the woods, but actual excavator works to build a built formal trail infrastructure. It's a long-term project, perhaps months, if not years, of building and machinery operating in these habitats. So we have to then consider that just the presence of those machines and people could disturb, damage, or destroy the resting places of a range of protected animal species. And then at some point during each year, you're going to get birds who want to nest on these habitats. And if you are still active there, you're going to disturb them from nesting, so they won't breed successfully. So you have a knock-on effect to the local population of that species, or you might push them to another habitat where there just happens to be more predators, so they get predated on. Our role in the ecosystem, even for that short period of time, gets thought about in our study. So that once we've done our baseline study of, hey, what lives on this site, the very next thing we do is we make a list like this of all the things that could go wrong if you don't think about them. And then the next part of our study really is, okay, so what measures are you going to put in place to avoid, mitigate, or if it's unavoidable, compensate for that impact? And that will be completely bespoke to the project. We'll design that in collaboration with the sort of trail architect and the construction company as a collaboration, because that will then get presented to our local authority and our governing bodies to say, okay, we've thought about the potential impacts. This is how we're going to get around it. Are you happy with that? And hopefully they approve the trail project.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. One of the programs I know here where I live in Atlanta, in the city, there is a tree ordinance, and for every tree of a certain size that needs to be cut down, even for a trail project, even a trail that's being built, in a city park or anywhere else, that there is a fee for each tree that you take out. And I imagine that part of that is to sort of compensate, like you said, for the loss of that tree, of that portion of the canopy. And again, here in Atlanta, especially, that can be a big part of the project. It can kill some projects because it's just too expensive to actually mitigate that loss of tree canopy, even to build, a single track trail.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And actually, for maybe the last 10 years or so, there's been quite a few economic models. So they try and put an economic figure on natural capital. So that a developer can say, well, hey, I'm going to remove this, so it'll cost me. I now know what it's going to cost me if I remove this. But actually, I'd say the majority of our projects don't go down that economic modeling. What they try and do is catch these problems at an early design stage, avoid everything that they possibly can, and then what they can't is factored into some form of environmental enhancement that goes alongside the project.
Okay.
And it might not be linked to mountain biking at all, but it could be something like, let's say you've designed your trail in a commercial forestry plantation, so it's fairly homogeneous, not particularly biodiverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's been heavily affected by human activity for a couple of 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now the trail project comes in and says, well, okay, we're going to harvest all this timber before we build the trails. What we're going to do is restructure this forest to the species woodland. So our project actually has diversity gain. So you can take a habitat. In the UK, we're kind of unlucky enough to have completely ruined almost all of our land. And when we look at some of our landscapes that we think are still wild, they're still pretty heavily affected by human activity from at least the Industrial Revolution, if not thousands of years before that. So there's loads and loads of opportunity in every project, whether it's a trail project or a wind farm or a hydroelectric scheme or a housing development scheme, to actually restructure the habitats that are left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And you can project within 5, 10, 20 or 100 years that the biodiversity net gain will far outweigh the minimal impacts that are unavoidable within design. But that's the role of your professional ecologist. That's the person that can say, well, hey, look, I've done background research on your land. We know what's gone on there for a long time. This is what you want to do. But from the outset, start factoring these things in. They won't cost you an awful lot of money, but you can have a real positive effect on local ecosystems. And that really improves the public relations of the project. You'll remove an awful lot of objections to the project as well, because even those who are not mountain bikers can now go and enjoy this area, which has got enhanced biodiversity. So that's really our role. Somebody once described the role of an ecologist in a project to me as the last advocate for the natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter what the project is. You are the advocate there that can have the biggest influence. And so we always try to get some betterment put into the project.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's good too, that to know that the ecologist is not the person who's standing off in the corner and saying, no, you can't do this. This is going to have a negative impact. If a smart ecologist is looking at it, they can say, well, this is an opportunity to actually improve the environment, to put it back closer to what it would have been naturally before humans arrived. And I think that's such a positive spin.
Yeah, I mean, the other element is, all of these projects are essentially requests for people to be in the landscape. Like, I want to build a housing development in this landscape, or I want to put employment through renewable energy in this landscape, or I want to ride my bike through this landscape. So it's not like a big rewilding initiative of removing people and therefore the planet Earth will look after itself. It's finding that compromise whereby we are part of that ecosystem, whether it's urban, peri-urban, or right out into the countryside. And I don't want to say out into the wild, because I don't think that much of the UK's land is wild.
Mm-hmm.
It's all been managed for something. So why not now manage it for, let's say it's a mountain bike project. Great, we're now going to manage it for a mountain bike project. But we still have to be responsible, and we still have to be custodians of that land, and we still have to take into account the needs of our local habitats, which contribute to the planet, which contribute to our actions on climate change. So it's all with the most positive attitude in mind. And yeah, you're right in what you say. Having an ecologist with that, who's kind of impartially acting for the project,
mm-hmm.
but is really the advocate for the environment, is valuable. And I would like to say, I mean, I was speaking to somebody today actually that, not every one of our projects that comes through our doors always ends up as an environmentally brilliant project.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do have projects where, we do have to have a difficult conversation with the client to say, this isn't great, guys.
Yeah.
What you're trying to aim for, you don't have the space within your project to compensate for what you're doing. And in those cases, all you can really do is provide the mathematical equation to the regulator to say, well, this is what's here, this is what they want to do, and it would be a negative environmental impact. But it's up to you guys whether you want to approve it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, on balance, most of them don't get approved.
Oh.
And sometimes not even for environmental reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You just find out in the fullness of time that there was a legal reason or a financial reason or something came in from left field, and the project just didn't go ahead, and it had to be redesigned and remodeled. And actually, suddenly there was space for the environment, and none of the bad design before was necessary. So actually, yeah, it's a tip to design, really. Design with the environment in mind, no matter what the project is, and you're probably, but it's such a cliche, work with nature,
right?
And it will be easier.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating, and I've taken projects from design right through to construction, and you watch a groundworks contractor battle against nature to build something, whether it's water coming out of the ground or water coming out of the sky, or they are, or the weather or the climate or anything. nature is a significant barrier to us constructing anything. And so if you take it into account from day one, then you're already got a head start as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this sort of the power and the will of nature in some cases. I want to ask you, how resilient is nature in terms of the ecosystem? And I'm sure it depends on where and sort of what you're considering to be the ecosystem. But, I have to admit that I've built some unofficial trails myself at times. And, part of my thought process was always, well, I'll ride this trail or I'll build this. And, if I don't come back here for a year or two, this is all going to just grow back and it's going to disappear and it'll be as if there was never a trail here. But is that true? Or are there sort of long-term effects due to trail building, especially if it's not done properly?
Yeah, I think that is true in the sense that you described it. A trail that doesn't get ridden will revegetate, and within a period of time, you'll barely know it was there. So yes, that's true. Hey, it depends how deep you dig your trail. If it's just a surface trail where you've scraped some loose vegetation off and you've ridden it, or it's an old deer trail or something, I know of trails that I look at and I think if people stop riding that within a couple of years, it would disappear. So in the fullness of time, I think is probably the way to think about that question. How resilient is our ecosystem at the moment? I mean, I could just sit here as an ecologist and say, hey, it's never been more fragile. Never. It's a really, but that's looking at it from a global perspective, not thinking, oh, hey, if you dig that trail, it's a terrible thing for the planet. But it is a sad state of affairs that actually every single thing we do, whether it's digging a trail, driving your car to work, eating food that's been shipped from around the planet, it all requires a chunk of natural capital. Now, whether that's something's been harvested from soils that can't cope with it, or something that's you put emissions into the atmosphere, everything, absolutely everything you do will require an input from the natural world. And actually, we come down to, it's just life choices. So at some point, there's a level of impact which you, the trail builder, deems acceptable in return for the output. You're going to build this rad trail, you're going to dig it so it's super durable. It just means you've got to dig all the topsoil down, get down to the subsoil. It's going to be absolutely fantastic, and loads of people are going to enjoy it. It's going to be great. There's an impact to that when you've got and it's acceptable to you for the return.
Right.
So the way I try and look at this is that the greater your impact, like if you're going to decide to do something, the greater your impact, then the more you might choose to personally mitigate for that in the same respect as the developers we were talking about.
Okay.
You might choose, well, hey, I do build trails, but actually in another part of my life, I give something back to the planet. I might do, I may be a volunteer from a trail association, or I might do some conservation work, or, I mean, the cliche is, hey, I recycle, so I can get away with it. Or I drive a Prius or whatever. I mean, take your pick. I mean, you're only judged by your peers. If you want to turn up to the trail in your Prius, but still dig trails, then, happy days. But yeah, resilience of ecosystems, you could think about it in a planetary scale like that, or you think about it at your local scale. And I think that's the most important for trail builders, trail riders. What impact are you having at your local scale? Are you digging that trail and it's not particularly resilient in wet weather? Well, it'll be fine in the dry. But there's 100 other people that will come and ride it in the wet, and they'll cause erosion and sedimentation. And so just having that little bit of extra environmental awareness kind of goes a long way, really. It doesn't stop you doing what you want to do. It might just alter your decision making as a designer. If you're digging trails, you are a trail designer. So, design it with the best outcome in mind, and have that thought that, well, what am I taking from natural capital here for the output? So it's like I said to you at the beginning, when I'm out riding my bike or I'm digging trails, those thought processes kind of go through my mind because that's what I do for 40 hours a week in my work. And so, it's just sort of part of me. I don't do ecology for a job. I am an ecologist, at heart. So it's kind of part and parcel of my daily actions, really. And I no doubt do loads of things that have an environmental impact. But what I try and do is balance that in my life with other aspects.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And for people who don't focus on that, it can seem overwhelming and like there's a lot to it and a lot to consider. Even if we're not building trails, what can we do as riders to minimize our impact aside from, having an impact and then like mitigating it elsewhere? What can we do actually on our rides? Like, is skidding bad? Like, is that the thing that we should stop skidding, or, should we avoid wet trails? I mean, it seems like there are, even just within the way that we choose to ride, there are ways that we can minimize our impact. What are some of the top ones, the ones you think would be like kind of the most important?
Skids and wheelies are just what it's all about, surely. if you like to skid, but then at the same time you're not engaging with your local trail builders or trail association, then you're having you're not even having an environmental impact. You're having a social impact,
right?
Because you're expecting somebody else to come and fix that corner that you just skidded around.
Yeah.
So it's like this little bit of well, hey, if that's the kind of person you are. I don't know any mountain bikers like that. So we're talking to a mountain bike audience.
Right.
Yeah, the more skids you do, the more you should donate to your trail association.
Yeah. But again, that's, I mean, I guess what you're saying too is, that you don't necessarily have to stop skidding. I mean, you can still have fun, but as long as you're giving back, as long as you're also the one digging and putting the trail back to the way it was.
Yeah. One of the questions I asked the riding community when we kind of first got started with the Trail Association was, does the weather dictate where you choose to ride? And of course, lots of people might not have an immediate choice of where they ride based on time or location. Mm-hmm. But generally, I think the way to minimize our impacts, really, in the context of where I live and the lack of formally built trail infrastructure, which has got a durable tread and is drained correctly, et cetera, we're relying on our natural capital to provide us trails. Mm-hmm. So therefore, for the people that know me and listen to this podcast and might just take one thing from this, in the context of Scotland, really, why not find out more about the habitat you're riding in, what the natural features are, mm-hmm. and really that should enhance your experience, but also it will give you that sense of custodianship over the land, and you might choose, your riding choices will dictate, will be dictated by the environment and what it can cope with. Mm-hmm. So Scotland, so we deal with a lot of wet weather. But actually, we get this really great run of beautiful dry weather that can take us right through summer, autumn, and into early winter. And so you can ride any trail without really thinking of an environmental impact of erosion. But then suddenly it starts to rain and snow, and it's pretty wet and horrible. And it's like, okay, so what do you choose to do? Do you choose to trash the trail so that it's completely trashed for everybody for the rest of the spring, just so that you can have a ride because it's the weekend and you have to ride, or other choices you can make? So there's that element in terms of like the land, like learn more about where you're riding, what lives there, and what should be avoided, and then learn more about what the type of geology that you're riding on and how that is affected by weather conditions. If you happen to live in a part of the world like me, which is very negatively affected by weather conditions. So,
Yeah, and
global impacts. Thinking about transport and travel, that has a carbon output. Your purchasing decisions. Those are the really big hitters that you can have to minimize the impact of mountain biking on the planet. Those should never be forgotten. It's not all just about badly dug or badly ridden trails.
yeah. Yeah. And, you mentioned that idea of being aware of the environments that you're riding through. And you actually connected me with one of your colleagues, Douglas, who we're going to be interviewing on follow-up to this, talking about a study that he did that sort of looked at that, at how mountain bikers' behavior changes once they're aware of sort of the potential environmental impact of how they ride. And I believe his study looked at wildlife in particular, about how, we're able to sort of mitigate our impact on wildlife. So that should be fascinating.
Yeah, and it's actually, hopefully it's contributed towards now a project which Dim Bins and the riding community of the Highlands of Scotland are now involved in trying to support that particular piece of wildlife. But I'm not going to ruin it for anybody if you have a follow-up. But
Spoiler
sadly,
alert, yeah.
I haven't actually read Douglas's paper, but I'm keen to read it. But he talked to me about it about a year ago or so, and it's really exciting. And he's a really nice guy, and couldn't have been a better person to do that piece of research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, like you said too, I guess that's another piece of mountain biking that we don't talk a lot about, but potentially has a big impact. You're talking about sort of your carbon footprint, I guess, for lack of a better word, in terms of like driving to the trail and, how do you get to the point where you're on your bike? It's not just about the ride. It's everything leading up to that. Like, which bike did you buy? We've looked at the impact of certain frame materials. Like, is an aluminum bike better than a carbon bike in terms of, the footprint and all that, the energy needs to create it and all those kinds of things. It's all related.
Yeah. More, it seems to me like more products and more companies are springing up to kind of solve that problem, really, which is great, because it means that the industry has recognized that that the consumers know that there is a problem, and they may have purchasing decisions. And like I say, this discussion really could be separated into global impacts and local impacts. But actually, the more we ignore the global impacts, the more your local habitat will suffer. We're a kind of an interesting region here in Scotland where, as an ecologist, you can see the advancement of species from the south to the north in reaction to global warming, which include actually invasive species, which have a detrimental effect on the environment, and so on and so forth. So again, I'll link it back to what I said before. Everything you do, absolutely everything you do, every mouthful of food you take off your plate has an environmental impact. Now, you could and this is just my point of view, you could burn an awful lot of your own personal energy being hyper worried and about minimizing every single thing that you do to the very nth degree, or you start looking towards innovation. Well, actually, not or, and you should start to look towards innovative thinking, technology, purchasing power, purchasing decisions, and then accepting that actually there is an impact that you have. But we're like the most adaptable species on the planet. So what can you do to adapt and overcome those problems? And what in your local area needs your help to overcome some of the problems of climate change that we're all contributing to in society, and just get involved. And it's like a call to arms, really, but there's always something you can get involved in to help something or somebody do life better.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's always.
But I am interested in that. I'm as an ecologist, I'm interested in that dynamic of how animals, like you said about Douglas, how animals are affected by our movement through the landscape. And one thing I wanted to kind of bring home was that when animals look at us moving through the landscape, we're a potential predator. That's why they run away. And so in a country where we don't have very many apex, high-end, really big predators, there's lots and lots of animals which consider themselves to be prey. So as you're moving through the woodland on your bike, they're looking at you going, oh my God, maybe it's going to eat me. So they run away. And then you ride on past, and they probably get on with their life because you're about the 18th predator they've run away from that day.
Yeah.
Now, so that's a very simplistic view, but what we then look at is sort of the cumulative effect. So you might have one rider rides through the woods and everything runs away for a minute, and then it gets back to doing what it was doing. And it's perfectly evolved to do that, to run away from predators. But if you have 1,000 riders riding down that trail, then you start to disperse wildlife. They won't stay there ever.
Yeah.
So you actually push them onto a neighboring habitat, and so they will have an ecosystem effect onto that neighboring habitat because you've disrupted something. So those population dynamics and behavioral effects very, very difficult to quantify. Somewhat easy to predict the effects of worst case scenario. But can also feature in impact assessment for the environmental factors of your project.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me because when I first started covering mountain biking in like the late 90s, early 2000s, it seemed like a lot of the talk was about erosion and, what are bikes doing to trails and to soils and things like that. And then over time, the conversation sort of evolved to being about this wildlife displacement and, are bikers more likely to displace animals than hikers, due to, again, the speed or the sound that we make or things like that. And to me, yeah, that's a really fascinating question and one that still seems to be open. There doesn't seem to be a lot of answers for that in terms of, the erosion thing. I feel like people have kind of moved on from that and have decided, yeah, we're all kind of equally guilty of that. But the wildlife issue, I feel like is still not something that's been resolved.
Yeah, it will be because it's hyper dynamic and there are no end of species to look at and gauge how stressed those species are about our presence. And so you'd have to take each one into consideration and then apply that consideration back to the overall ecosystem that animal is contributing to. But for a very easy, maybe relatable one that could be considered on an international scale, in the UK, you're probably most likely to disturb woodland deer. So as you're riding down, you're going to disturb some deer. If that's a really popular trail, you're going to push those deer onto the neighboring habitat. The neighboring habitat might be a really sensitive piece of grassland,
right? And
so the deer now feel like the only option they have is to hang out on this grassland, and they'll eat it all. And then the favorable condition of that grassland, which might be very sensitive, starts to decline because you're having a knock-on effect from an increased user group in their preferred habitat. So but you just have to, throughout the whole of the project, as it evolves, those issues might get raised, questioned, investigated, and then you might find a solution to that through the mitigation in your design. So I'd like to say in the UK, if you've got a good ecology team on your project, then it's very rare now that you have an absolute showstopper. Like, it just absolutely cannot happen, full stop, no way. There's options and there's methods, and there's usually a need to do something good for your environment. So as long as you're committed to doing that, then things can find a balance.
Yeah. Well, that being said, in your opinion, are there certain places on the planet where bikes shouldn't go, where we shouldn't be allowed to build trails?
Okay, so I'll drop the ecologist flag for a moment, and I'll just say no.
Right. Because as a mountain biker, no.
Yeah. The bicycle is such an incredible invention And like we're so blessed really to have it in our lives, and the bicycle as a thing just keeps getting better and better. And from my point of view, bikes have the capacity to teach us so much and contribute to society and keep us mobile. And for me personally, it brings people together in such a unique way.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said at the beginning, I've been able to speak to so many more mountain bikers about the ecology of the woodlands that they ride in, and they might ride there every single week, and I'm usually able to tell them something about the woodland that they didn't know.
Interesting.
And it raises awareness. Now, if it hadn't been for the bike, then they wouldn't be aware.
Right.
And yeah, Danny McCaskill's film, I think this week on the slabs, proves that you can ride a bike pretty much anywhere. So go for it. Ride your bike, but be aware. That's all that's required.
Yeah. Well, finally, I want to ask you how you would grade the mountain bike industry's overall eco footprint.
Okay. I thought about this question because you gave them to me earlier, and improving. That's what I came down to.
Yeah.
Improving.
Not as bad as cars. Right?
No. Well, even the car industry is improving.
It's true.
Massively,
We're all improving.
Yeah, it's improving, and it's all down to Johan Borelli, as far as I'm concerned. That man is an absolute powerhouse for the environment, and I'm following his new bike deal with great interest.
So again, it comes down to awareness for you, right? I mean,
yeah, it comes down to awareness. I mean, it's going to sound really hard. When things don't go right, you could arguably say that it comes down to arrogance or ignorance. And ignorance can be completely innocent, arrogance less so, perhaps. But, the more we all love being in these environments. So, and there's been plenty written about them, and there's the information's all there to find out. And there's people like myself riding bikes all the time. So, ask and speak to people and just find out a little bit more about, even if it's not about the ecological science, just how that landscape that you're riding in is actually managed. What are the management priorities? It could be a commercial timber woodland, so that's the main priority of the woodland, is to grow timber for the construction industry. If you just find out a little bit more about it, you then start to make decisions about where a trail might go, or whether a local trail infrastructure project in that environment is suitable, if that's the right location, etc., etc. So it's just the more you're aware, then the more you're engaged with the subject. And if you care about the environment that you ride in, then engage with it. There's always something to find out. But really, how's the eco footprint? I thought really that we have an incredible opportunity to create quality experiences in cherished landscapes.
Yeah.
And the bike facilitates that. We should ride our bikes. We should be proud of riding our bikes, and we should be outward looking, and maybe we should evolve to a point where we're able to see ourselves as others see us.
Mm-hmm.
So if you link back to your quote about the equestrian industry or hikers,
mm-hmm.
how do they see us?
Right.
If they see us in a negative light, then maybe we've got something to do. Hopefully they see us in a positive light. So let's, if we see ourselves positively, then we just need to check every now and again. And in my opinion, we see ourselves as others see us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really, really insightful and really wise. Because I was going to bring up that, to some of these outside groups, they don't see mountain bikers necessarily as environmental stewards. And yet, if we ask ourselves, we would all say, well, sure, we love the environment. We love nature. That's why we're out here. We enjoy these outdoor spaces in these wild places. But yeah, there is sort of a disconnect between our sort of how people see us, how outside groups see us versus how we see ourselves. And maybe that means we need to change something.
Yeah, absolutely. And to bring it back to the Trail Association movement, and really from an insider's point of view in helping those guys get things set up and running, really that's the opportunity that we have as a community to promote how we really feel about the environment and what we want to do for our environments.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, what we're asking of the environment is that we get to enjoy really good trails.
Yeah.
So if you make your trails good and they're environmentally good and you've got nothing to defend because you've thought about it and you've designed it well and you've researched your site and you've done things to the best of your ability, then it's hard to criticize.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, it's been very, very interesting time.
Yeah. We can enjoy it with a clean conscience. And that makes it all the better.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. And just keep constantly self-assessing as well. Like what's coming next, whatever technology is coming next. As soon as we stop improving and stop developing how we do things, then the world will pass us by and we will be seen as old-fashioned and having too much of an impact. So let's stay. I'm quite keen that we stay ahead of the game here and actually promote what we're doing alongside mountain biking. It's not just about digging and riding. It's a whole culture.
Right. Yeah. That's great. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining us. This has been super enlightening and insightful. And thank you.
Oh, absolute pleasure. I'm a big fan of the podcast. It's an absolute honor to be here.
All right. Well, that's all we've got this week. We'll talk to you next week.